The number to call 0345 6060 973. You can ask a question about how the budget might affect you, particularly if you belong to one of the groups who you think might be advantaged or disadvantaged by something in the budget. Well, let me introduce you to my panel. Gerard Lyons is Senior Fellow at Policy Exchange and Chief Economic Strategist for Netwealth Investments. Anne Ashworth is a property and finance writer and commentator. Carys is Executive Director of the Institute for Public Policy Research, the IPPR, and Iain McCafferty, former member of the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee and a senior advisor at Oxford Economics. So the lines are open, as I say, 0345 6060 973. You can watch us on Global Player, on the LBC website at lbc.co.uk, or on the LBC YouTube and Facebook channels.
0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, before we start with the calls and texts, I just want to go around the table and ask you each what you made of this budget. What were you expecting? Did the Chancellor deliver? What were the good things? What were the bad things? What do you think the long-term effect of this will be? All in 90 seconds, if you could, Iain McCafferty.
90 seconds for the lot. OK. Well, I thought it was a clever budget, very clever politically and very well delivered. I have to say that as he sat down, it reminded me of the budgets of more than 10 years ago, in that more like a Gordon Brown budget than a more recent Conservative budget, not only because of the big measures, but also because of the length of the speech and the amount of detail and the barrage of data. So in one sense, it was very reminiscent. And I think certainly, I do think that if we look at it in the broad, I think it does really mark a watershed moment in terms of the end of the philosophy that the Conservative government has followed for a good number of years now in terms of low tax, small state. Essentially, we're now entering an era of much bigger government, both in terms of the tax level as a proportion of GDP and in terms of the spending as a proportion of GDP. We're moving now to the highest levels for a generation and more. And I think that's going to be with us for quite some time. So I think that explains, why Rishi Sunak had to emphasise his low tax credentials towards the end of the budget. But clearly that's not quite in line with the way the budget went, in that essentially we've used all of the money that has been saved by the better performance of the economy this year than had originally been expected, to nearly all of it's gone on increasing spending.
And Ashworth.
I liked Rishi Sunak's classless delivery. It was a real pitch to be thought of as a future Prime Minister. I liked his upbeat optimism, but all the way through I was thinking, why aren't I hearing about certain things? I felt as if I heard an awful lot about Prosecco, but nothing about greening up our homes. And we're just days away from COP26. I found that quite peculiar. Also, that key pledge made by Boris Johnson on turning generation rent into generation buy. I felt like saying, I want to hear something about first-time buyers. And there was much made of this money for homes on brownfield sites, but the money works out to about £11,000 per home, which we know won't get anywhere on a site that needs an awful lot of care taken of it. And like Iain, I was thinking of the budgets of the past. Remember those people we used to call the squeezed middle? And boy, are they going to be squeezed. I mean, this is excellent if you're working on universal credit. The taper on universal credit is going to give these people, that group, some more money in their pockets. But for an awful lot of people who don't regard themselves as affluent, who are going to be hit by all the things that weren't announced in the budgets, like the freezing of the income tax thresholds and the personal allowances, and by higher national insurance, the income tax that dare not speak its name, and also by higher inflation, which is something that I thought Rishi Sunak was slightly evasive about. I mean, does he believe, like the Bank of England, it's going to be transitory, or is it going to be hanging around for a while and likely to go over about 5%? But there are quite a few people who will be several £100 worse off by 22-23, and they would have had no idea during the whole of that budget, which may be a great achievement on his part, but is basically less than sincere.
OK. Carys?
Well, I had a very high bar for this budget because I think there were really big challenges facing the Chancellor. Firstly, a cost of living crisis. There are huge bill rises coming down the track for families this winter. Secondly, public services. We know that public services are crying out for investment following a decade of underinvestment.
Well, they're getting it in this budget, aren't they?
I'll come to that in a second. And then also his rhetoric about wanting a new economy. Now, I couldn't agree more. I definitely want a new economy. For me, the budget missed the mark on some of those things. So there were some really good measures in there, including the taper rate of universal credit that we've just heard about. That's really important. Minimum wage rise, really important. It doesn't completely compensate for the billions of pounds we've seen cut from universal credit for some of the most struggling families. There, in terms of that kind of broader vision for the new economy, if you look at the government's two agendas, levelling up and net zero, which it says are its key agendas, there really wasn't much in there on those, and particularly on net zero. We have countries gathering in the UK next week to try and address the climate crisis together. Frankly, there was not enough investment for the UK to lead the way in this budget, and with measures such as cutting air passenger duty for domestic flights, that just goes in completely the wrong direction. I think he will actually regret that politically.
Gerard.
Well, good evening. It's great to be on the programme. I was very constructive about this budget. I think all budgets need to be judged in the context of the time. The UK economy, like other economies, has just suffered from a major pandemic. Also, it's often not said, we still haven't fully recovered from the global financial crisis of 2008. Globally, public debt levels are at an all-time high. Globally, interest rates are at an all-time low. So there are global pressures. These are not unique to the UK. But the good thing about today's budget was it confirmed that the economy is recovering, that public finances are improving, and that borrowing is on the way down. At the same time, in terms of the measures taken, I think the Chancellor and indeed the Prime Minister should be given a lot of credit for increasing departmental spending. George Osborne's austerity is out the door. It seems to me the government is criticised if they don't spend, and then when they do spend, they're criticised as well. That being said, there is a big challenge, and the challenge is that the UK economy needs to deliver much stronger growth. Halfway through his speech, the Chancellor said that not just him, but governments need to be judged by what they do, not just by what they say, and therein lies the challenge. The real challenge after this budget is to deliver on a pro-growth economic strategy. If the economy does well, the public finances fall into shape, there's lots of room for manoeuvre. If the economy disappoints, then the question is what happens to the public finances? Does the Chancellor in the future then borrow, squeeze spending, raise taxes, or does he actually rely, as he should, on economic growth? The challenge, of course, is that with this budget, because they manage it so well, lots of the measures that were bad news, shall we say, were pre-announced, although they were included within the Red Book. The tax increases of a few weeks ago, I would have been against. The spending increase today, in favour of. But when you add them all together, it was a very generous budget when you look at the detail in the Red Book. But the challenge is he now needs to deliver on sustained economic growth.
Well, Tim in Canterbury sent this text before he heard your answer. He says, Iain, will you invite doomsters and anti-budget pundits onto your programme for the rest of the show? After the worst global pandemic since the early 20th century, with eye-watering borrowing to get us out of the disaster that is COVID, who would have thought the Chancellor would announce an increase of public spending in excess of £150 billion? But you'll all carry on bashing the Tories. Well, that's Tim's view. Hopefully.
Good guy, Tim.
Right, there's lots of calls coming in if you want to join the programme, and if you've got any specific question, not just on sort of macroeconomic policy, but on specifics, do give us a call, and I'm sure one of our pundits here will be able to answer your question. 0345 6060 973. James is in Ayrshire. Hello, James.
Good evening, Iain. My question is, given that the government's economic policy during the COVID epidemic and the current spending commitments in this budget, do the panel agree with me that this, in effect, is the most left-wing government the United Kingdom has seen since Mr Attlee's administration in 1945?
Well, none of us can remember Mr Attlee's administration, but I know what you mean. I mean, I described this budget earlier as one that Ed Balls might have been proud to give, Carys.
It's certainly true. I think Ian's right in saying that there has been a definite shift in tone. And in terms of the increase to departmental spending, which is extremely welcome, that is clearly a shift from the Osborne era of fiscal policy. That being said, the spending on those departments isn't even as high as it was in 2010 in most cases. So if you look at, for instance, funding of housing and communities, that's down 60% in real terms compared to 2010. So
but
I think
each department has got a real terms increase this year, haven't they?
Compared to last year, but if we're talking about the last 70 years, then I think we need to put that in context. We also need to put the spending exactly in the context of the economic situation. So we are facing permanent damage to the UK economy. The Office for Budget Responsibility thinks that's about 2%, but there's a lot of uncertainty. It might be much higher. And countries that have spent more, as economic theory would suggest, are actually seeing that their economies are not seeing that damage in the long term. So, for instance, the United States. So I don't think that we've seen a complete about turn in the government's approach.
Iain McCafferty, the most left-wing government since Clement Attlee.
I must admit, I always try and resist describing governments either as very left-wing or very right-wing. I don't think that's very helpful in economic terms. But I do think that this is what you might call the start of a bigger government than we've seen for quite considerable time. And if you consider that to be left-wing, then fair enough. But I don't think it is. I think it's a philosophical issue within economics about whether the government takes responsibility for a large part of the economy, both in terms of taxation, raising money, and then spending it again, or whether it stands back and expects the private sector to do much of the heavy lifting. And here, I think we are seeing this big shift, so that the call of James is right, that in terms of government spending and in terms of government taxation, we are going back. I mean, I think I found 1 year in the early 1980s when tax and spend was slightly higher than the figures that we will get to by 2025. But other than that, it was going back to the early 1950s, the end of the Attlee government, when we had taxation at sort of 40%, 42%, and spending up towards 46% at its maximum. So from that point of view, I think we are seeing what you might have called a left-wing government, or a government that intends to take on responsibility for a number of the big issues of our time. Now, I do think this is not specifically to do with COVID. This is actually, I think, to do much more with longer-term demographics and the shape of our economy. The fact that we are growing older, the fact that we are living longer, the fact that our medical care costs more than it used to because of technological advance, all means that if you have a public sector health system and care system now, then you will need to spend increasing proportions of your economy on those as the economy, as the population ages. So I do think that we were due to see public spending rise as a proportion of GDP slowly over the course of the next 10 or 20 years. But I do think Rishi Sunak has embraced that in this budget.
Gerard, you're somebody who's seen as on the right economically, but you seem to be embracing this budget, which James in Ayrshire thinks is a very left-wing budget.
Well, I think there are two economic historical perspectives that are very relevant here. One is, after the Second World War, debt to GDP was 250%. Today, it's a phenomenally high 98%. But after the war, we reduced the debt to GDP, not by unnecessary tax increases, not by unnecessary spending squeezes, but by growing the economy. And the economy grew, so debt to GDP, the growth component picked up, and that allowed things to improve. And indeed, one of the two new fiscal rules, I'm not a big fan of fiscal rules. They tend not to stand the test of time. But today, for once, the Chancellor announced half of his fiscal rules. One of them was a sensible one, reducing debt to GDP. So that's the historical context. But the other thing that's relevant in terms of the left-wing aspects from James is the 1960s. Harold Wilson in 1964 said that you can be in office, but you're not in power. Power lies with the Treasury. He tried to change it because the Treasury has two mandates. In other countries, they divide their political departments. Here, the Treasury's mandate is to balance the budget and to grow the economy. They don't do a particularly good job, you might argue, in terms of balancing the budget, but it tends to supersede growing the economy. What we now have, in my view, is a Chancellor and a Prime Minister who've decided they don't want to just balance the budget. They do want the budget deficit to come down through debt to GDP, as it did after the Second World War, but they recognise they need to grow the economy. So it's not a case of left or right wing. It's coming back to Ian's point. It's about implicitly, good economics is good politics, and you have to judge the context in which you're looking at the government.
There is an argument that it's very, very Tory to provide excellent public services, because if people are happier, healthier, better educated, are they not more able to work and pay higher taxes? It's rather like the argument for providing good social housing. The people that live in it are happier, healthier, more likely to be educated, see their children go through school properly, and that would be the way for us to get the productivity increases that we need. I think Rishi Sunak started a very great debate as to what exactly a Tory means now, because a Tory can now be a big government Tory. It's no longer this assumption that you're a small state politician if you're a Tory. And, and indeed, that was a very recent assumption. If you were one nation Tory, you would have believed in very good public services.
Okay, Dan in London has got a question for James in Ayrshire. He says, James from Ayrshire really sounds like a covert Ian Blackford. Could it be him? James, can you reassure us that you are not Ian Blackford?
I am not him, Ian, but I agree very much with your last speaker. I think this is a decisive shift to the left in UK politics, and I think actually the UK is leading other democracies in Western Europe, and I think other democracies in Western Europe will shortly move to the left as well. I think this is a real game changer just now. I really do.
James, thank you very much indeed. It's a slightly racist question there, wasn't it? Saying basically all Scottish people sound the same, but there we are. It's 19 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
22 minutes past 8 on Cross Question. Ian McCafferty is here, Anne Ashworth, Carys Roberts and Gerard Lyons. They're taking your calls, 0345 6060 973. Alexandra is in Farnborough. Alexandra, hi, what would you like to ask?
Hi, Ian.
Hi.
I was just after some clarity on business rates, please, because I've heard and read it's 110k per business is the rates relief, but I suppose as a retailer, what I wanted to hear was 50% on every site, capped at 110k, which is, the difference is tenfold from a saving perspective. So I just wondered if there was any sort of clarity on that had come out in the detail.
Have you got multiple sites?
Yes, we do, yeah.
Anne Ashworth, break this gently to Alexandra.
Well, Alexandra, I think you need to get your accountant onto this one, because this is not a very clear area, but it looks as if you've got multiple sites that you won't be benefiting. I think earlier in the show, Kate Nichols, who speaks on behalf of the hospitality industry, said that people with several outlets would not benefit. And because this is a tax cut worth only 1.7 billion, which would suggest that even though 90% of all retail, hospitality and leisure businesses are supposed to be seeing a discount of 50%, there must be very severe restrictions on it. So I would think that you get your accountant on this tomorrow to ask exactly what the position of your business is.
So they've directed the money at the smaller businesses.
At the independents, to breathe some life into our high streets. But yet this is just like the typical budget. It seems more generous than it possibly is. But I hope when your accountant looks into it, there's better news for you, Alexandra.
Alexandra, thank you very much. Let's go to Nicola in Greenwich. Hi, Nicola.
Hi, Ian. Can you hear me?
We can. What would you like to ask?
Great. So I work for the civil service, but I've also worked for the private sector and charities. And I'm just confused as to why the government keeps on saying that increased productivity will come with higher wages. The reason I'm asking is in all of those jobs, I've seen whenever they've tried to change processes, make them more streamlined or introduce new technology, there's been strong resistance from the workforce to either upskill or to change the way they normally do things. And I just don't understand why they keep saying increased wages is going to lead to more productivity when that is a clear problem.
Ian McCafferty.
Well, the government would argue, I think, that there are two potential ways in which increasing wages can lead to increasing productivity. I have to say that neither of them are necessarily particularly good news for the workforce. The first is, as we can see from comparison with a number of continental European economies, if you raise the wage levels, particularly for lower paid, what you might call lower productivity workers, you have fewer of those workers in employment, as we see from the very high levels of unemployment that we have in France relative to this country. It is because we have higher levels of wages that those that cannot deliver high productivity simply don't get employed in the first place. So you can raise the average productivity level for the economy as a whole by raising wages, but at the cost of higher unemployment. The second way in which the government would rather see, I think, is that essentially having to pay higher wages encourages or forces employers to invest rather more, and therefore, hopefully, the deepening of the capital stock will therefore also increase productivity. But again, if you're replacing workers with capital, then it's not necessarily very good for your levels of employment either. I would have said normally the way economists would look at this is to say you increase productivity through increasing skills, increasing investment, improving the ways in which you do business, and then you can afford to pay higher wages, not the other way around.
Carys, it's been the way for decades, I think, in this country that our productivity has been very low compared to our main competitors. How do you answer Nicola's question?
Well, I'd agree with a lot of what Ian said already. I do think that there is a strong argument to raise wages in order to trigger investment in the economy. I do think that's an important way to achieve that. And there is that virtuous cycle between productivity and raising wages. Now, the government is talking about it, those two things in tandem, is saying that it wants a high productivity, high wage economy. the eagle-eyed or eagle-eared might have heard that Sunak, when he was talking about the fundamentals of the economy, did not talk about rising wages. And actually, if you look at what the Office for Budget Responsibility showed today, average real wages in 2026, so that's average wages and what you can actually, adjusted for what you can actually purchase, are set to be lower in 2026 than 2008. And that is an absolutely shocking figure. We should all be deeply worried by that. To get out of the rut, we do need proper investment. We need the economic growth that Gerard's been talking about in order to push those wages up.
Gerard?
Yeah, well, coming back to 2008, it's interesting. Prior to the global financial crisis, and it sounds like we're talking about a lot of history tonight, prior to that, the productivity gap between the UK and other countries had closed. And back in 2008, the trend rate of UK growth was around 2.25%, which meant that in real terms, take out inflation, the UK economy doubled in size in 32 years. Sounds like a long time, but that was pretty impressive. By 2016, productivity had slumped, and the UK economy's trend rate of growth was down to 1.3, 1.4%, which meant that then it would take 60 years to double in size. And it hasn't changed since. So addressing the productivity issue is really central to achieving stronger economic growth. Now, if one thinks of it, I tend to think of a barbell. Barbell, you have a bar, and then you have weights at either end. 3 out of 5 people in the UK work in pretty high productive, high wage jobs. Obviously, the wages vary considerably, but 2 out of 5 work in low wage, low skilled, low productivity jobs. So coming back to Nicola's point, the reason why we tend to see this association and why the Prime Minister associated wages with productivity at the Conservative conference was that he saw this group as needing to be addressed. Now, there was research carried out a few years ago, I think it was by the Centre for Social Justice, that showed that in low-skilled jobs, 9 out of 10 people, when they enter the low-skilled job, remained in it without having any money spent on their training. And therefore, Iain touched on the key point, economists see it the other way around. Let's raise productivity by increasing investment. But in actual fact, they go hand in hand. Investment goes hand in hand, but productivity goes hand in hand with wage increases. Nicola's point, though, about the inertia amongst people is quite interesting. In some respects, that shows a challenge across the country, but it also shows a challenge within different companies as well. And it comes back, maybe we need to lead from the top. It needs a buy-in from the very, very top. Hence, I think it's right that the government talks about this, to actually get more companies being pressed to actually spend more on investment. The UK scores so low in terms of robotics investment, but it also scores low, and this is why you needn't worry about losing your job, in terms of all the other skill training that goes with any career.
Nicola, what do you make of what you've heard?
I'm just listening patiently. The thing I wanted to add is I think it's important to just understand that simply investing in technology, or if you're talking about investment in that area, doesn't in itself lead to high value, because you still need people to use the technology to make their job more efficient. And I think there's a bit of a misnomer that just spending loads of money on tech and loads of money on automation is naturally going to make that organisation more efficient. And that's why you see so many failed IT projects. I do think I do quite a lot of networking with people in Asia and Africa. I've seen a much higher demand for training and upskilling in those nations than I do in the West, and I don't know if that's being addressed either. So I think investment will help, but I don't think it's going to be the solution if you don't have a workforce that are willing to adapt and change and actually upskill themselves to be fit for the 21st century.
Well, Nicola, it says on my screen you're a new caller. Thank you very much for your call. We get a better class of caller on this station, don't we? I mean, I was sort of listening there, absolutely rapt, because obviously Nicola's got a lot of experience, and thank you for that call. Right, more questions coming up, 0345 6060 973. It's news time at 8:32 with Serena Farrow.
The Chancellor's announced changes to universal credit to help support struggling families to cope with the rising cost of living. There's also support for pubs, the aviation industry, as well as the retail and hospitality sectors. A Metropolitan Police officer has been remanded in custody after appearing in court charged with rape. 28-year-old Adam Zarman from Romford is accused of assaulting a woman on Sunday at a hotel in central London. And police investigating the shooting of cinematographer Helena Hutchins says they suspect more live rounds were on the set of Alec Baldwin's movie. Officers say the actor is cooperating with authorities after firing what he'd been told was a safe prop gun. LBC weather, persistent rain, particularly for southern Scotland, northwest England and western Wales this evening. Dry elsewhere, though, with lows of 10 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
It's 8:36. Let me reintroduce my panel to you. Carys Roberts is Executive Director of the IPPR think tank. Anne Ashworth is a property and finance writer and commentator. Iain McCafferty is former member of the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee and Senior Economic Advisor to Oxford Economics. And Dr. Gerard Lyons is Senior Fellow at Policy Exchange and Chief Economic Strategist for Netwealth Investments. So they're here to take your questions. The number to call, 0345 6060 973. Let's go to a fellow Essex man, Rob in Whittam. Hello, Rob.
Good evening, Ian. My question to the panel is, why do none of the political parties want to appeal and create economic fiscal policies that appeal to the middle and upper income earning members of society?
That's a good question, Anne.
I'd like to know what groups that you really see. I mean, are we describing that like the middle classes as they do in America, which is basically a skilled worker? What sort of level of affluence do you think you've got in mind here?
Well, all I'm really referring to is a lot of the recent policy announcements, the minimum wage, and then you compare that against the national insurance increase. It's catering for the lower members and lower earning members of society. I'm lucky enough to be in the top 5%. I'm not expecting anyone to start feeling sorry for me, but I just don't really feel like any of the political parties are really trying to attract my vote at the moment.
I think, well, they certainly would like your vote, but they're not in a position to be able to afford it. And I think throughout the budget, I kept hearing that word sacrifice. And I don't know if anybody else in the studio heard it, which indicated to me that there's more taxes on the way in forthcoming budgets for those who are better off. And there'd been a lot of expectation that there would be maybe a capital gains tax increase in this budget. It didn't come. He didn't touch the pension tax release. He didn't make inheritance tax more of a penalty. So I would, for the moment, congratulate yourself that you probably got off okay in this budget and just brace yourself for more, because somehow or other all this public spending has got to be paid for, and the better off are the people most liable to be taxed for that.
That's an interesting point, isn't it, Carys? Because I remember when George Osborne reduced the top rate of tax from 50 to 45p, but wouldn't quite go all the way to 40, and got an absolute bashing for it, didn't he? And it's quite a difficult one, isn't it, for any political party to reward people at the top end of the income scale rather than at the bottom, for obvious reasons.
I mean, it is, but I have to say, looking at what the Chancellor has done, I was slightly challenged that he's not doing anything to benefit the higher earners in society. I certainly do think there is a problem with the middle, and, you know, particularly if you look at the prospect for wages, I think that's quite worrying for a lot of people, although we do all share in the benefits when we fund public services better, and that has to be said. But if you look at how the Chancellor is approaching people on top incomes, he needed more funding for social care, and he chose national insurance contributions as the means to do that. National insurance contributions are not charged on, for instance, high-earning pensioners, or in fact, any earning pensioners. They're not charged on money that people might get from being a landlord, and so on. And so those choices are inherently benefiting some of the wealthiest in our society. And I think that does need to be said when looking at his actions as a whole.
Gerard, this word incentives, which we used to hear a lot about in the 1970s, that's gone out of the economic lexicon now, hasn't it?
In fact, it was the word I've written down here: incentives matter, and global competition. I think Rob's touched on the key point, or a key point. First and foremost, it should be said stronger economic growth should benefit us all, whether we're low, medium or high income. Also, at the same time, one of the issues behind the current debate that Rob talks about is about improving opportunities. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. But to take it to the next level, undoubtedly there should be measures to help medium and high earners, because incentives do matter, and global competition. Look at the moment, one of the highest spending, higher taxed economies in Western Europe, France, is trying to give that incentive, that carrot to people in the city to move to Paris. They're offering cheap tax deals, etc. So tax is a key factor. Policy Exchange think tank I'm with, but also Centre for Policy Studies, did a report last week about tax competition being a key issue. And you do need to address this. And Carys talked about pensioners and landowners. And fair enough, she raised key points. But I think Rob's question goes to workers. You need, if you're working, to have lower rates of tax. And also the other issue that we seem to now willingly accept is that the cost of living in terms of housing should be high. It's not only after your tax, but it's also after your necessary spending, which is on housing, and then it's off for many people, it's transport pre-pandemic. These are areas where we need to reduce the tax rate. We actually need to get the cost of housing down, or start to reduce the tax on housing. And the challenge is that I don't think we should be talking about higher taxes in the future. That's the wrong way to go. If we have a pro-growth economic vision and deliver on it, taxes should come down. I would be very much against against wealth taxes, and I would actually be arguing for inheritance tax to come down as well, which reinforces the incentive point. But incentives do matter, but I fear that we're trying to put one group against another group. Overall, it's a case of improving opportunity, increasing the rate of economic growth so we all benefit. But important for future growth is to make sure that we don't overly tax or burden middle and high earners.
Iain McCafferty.
I agree very much with what Gerard's just said, because I think incentives do clearly matter hugely, particularly when individuals and companies are very mobile on the in the global market. So if we do, it's very easy to sort of squash the eggs that are supposedly laid by that golden goose. And so I do think we have to take care with this. At the same time, I think if we look back at the trends of the last 20 years, the most wealthy portions of society, or sections of society, have actually done rather better than some of the lower wealth sections of society, largely as a result of the inflation in asset prices. Certainly between 2000 and 2010-12, the rise in house prices benefited those who owned properties significantly relative to those that didn't. And since then, the degree of quantitative easing that we've seen, of which I was certainly responsibly, at least in part, has helped support stock markets, a good thing for the economy generally, but which has helped those who own stocks and shares relative to those that don't. So I think we have to look also, as well as the incentives point, we have to balance that with the need for some sort of concern for inequality and not to exacerbate that.
Since you mentioned quantitative easing, when you've been on this programme before, you and I have had a little bit of a ding-dong about that, because although your economic expertise far outweighs mine, but I've always thought that you can't break the basic laws of economics, and if you print a lot of money, inevitably inflation follows at some point. Now, the inflation that we're seeing in the economy now, I think you can attribute to a lot of things, but can it be attributed in part to quantitative easing?
I would say in the UK that a small part of it may well, certainly with hindsight, be considered to be the fact that the quantitative easing programme has gone on for a little long. Had I still been on the Monetary Policy Committee, I probably would have stopped the quantitative easing programme back in the early autumn when it was first discussed, and the bank voted against it. So from that point of view, you could say that a very small proportion of the inflation may be because we're getting a little bit of over-stimulus as we've gone through the autumn, but it is a very small proportion of the total.
Can I say something on this?
Do.
I think the Bank of England should be criticised far more heavily than it is. Indeed, the Chancellor alluded to that in his speech today. The way I would describe them is, for the last year, they've driven the car with their foot on the accelerator hard down, and they've passed sign after sign after sign that said inflation pressures ahead, cost pressures building. They've ignored them. They've not only kept interest rates low, they continue to print money through quantitative easing when they needn't have done. Now we are at a situation where the economy, if we think of it as a car, is at the bottom of a steep hill, and the bank seems to want to put its foot on the brake. In the debate here about the exit strategy, everyone seems to think it's only interest rates that can go up. Quantitative easing, the printing of money, should stop and should be reversed before we start to even talk about interest rates going up. We haven't had this proper debate in the UK because we call the Bank of England independent, and therefore we don't hold it to account as much as we should. And it was the Lord Forsyth Committee this summer, probably for the first time for 20 years since Maurice Peston ran the similar committee, that really started to ask the questions that should have been asked for some time about the policies at the Bank of England.
I've got to let you come back on that, Iain.
I don't disagree with a lot of what Gerard has been saying, to be honest. I do think that we should have slackened off on the accelerator somewhat earlier, because we're not only supporting the economy but actually stimulating it with interest rates as low as they are and with the continuation of the quantitative easing programme. Now, that QE programme will finish in December, so it's not as if we got much further to go anywhere, at which point I think we could say that they are finally listening. But I do agree. I was always known as a hawk, so if I say that I've seen similar signals to those that Gerard has mentioned and have been somewhat concerned, perhaps people won't be too surprised. But I would have certainly been rather more worried about inflation rather earlier than the current Monetary Policy Committee seems to have been.
OK, we'll come to more of your questions in just a moment. It's 8:47.
LBC. Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Weekday mornings from 7.
Senior Conservative MP and former Housing Secretary Robert Jenrick, you're put out today to talk about how we're going to hear about fiscal responsibility, and you've just wasted 37 billion quid. You're hopeless.
Well,
you're not fiscally responsible, you're fiscally incompetent.
On the specifics of track and trace, this was a programme that delivered, I think, over 300 million tests. 20 million people were contacted. Undoubtedly, it saved people's lives.
Tomorrow morning, Chancellor of the Exchequer Rishi Sunak joins Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Listen on your radio and on Global Player, LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:51. We've talked a lot about inflation. Let's just have a brief chat about interest rates. And can you give me your predictions as to when you think interest rates might rise? Because if you have inflationary pressures in the economy, one way of getting inflation down is to increase interest rates. And I think a lot of people have got out of the habit of looking at the possibility of increased interest rates. Anne?
we're at a time in our history when we really need our central bankers, both in the US and the UK, to make really good calls. And I don't kind of feel the confidence that I should do, particularly in Jerome Powell of the Federal Reserve making the right call for American interest rates, which has a huge consequence for us. Going back to the Bank of England, I suspect that they will be seriously considering a tiny interest rate rise as early as next month in order to start to clamp down on inflation. And these rising interest rates and rising inflation are not something that so many people have experienced for so long. I mean, you need to be really, really old to remember what double-digit mortgage rates or anything like that are. But whatever, I just hope that our central bankers, whether it's the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve, are really, really, really pondering these decisions, because these are crucial to the recovery of global economies now.
Iain, when you were on the Monetary Policy Committee, I seem to remember that you did vote for rises, but you were always outvoted.
No, my last ever meeting, we increased interest rates from 0.5
That was just
to
a sympathy vote because it was your last meeting.
It's only a few weeks ago, if you look at market pricing, that markets didn't expect any interest rate rise until at least the end of 2022, and that the rates would never rise to more than 1% in any horizon for the future. Clearly, that's now been adjusted, and following a number of interventions from current MPC members and the governor himself, markets now expect that the first rate rise will be imminent. Whether it's one of the two meetings that the bank has before the end of the year, November or December, I think is still touch and go. And if you start to look at the statements of the individual 9, coming up with a majority of 5 from that is still not that easy.
But you would be voting for an increase?
I would be voting for an increase, and there are 2 members who are already voting for some sort of, or had been voting to slow down the QE programme. Now, whether that translates for them into a rate rise instead has yet to be seen. But there are 2 members who are already worried. The question is, can you get to that 5 or more before the end of the year? If not, then I think it will be in the early new year.
Carys, it's not inconceivable that you could be on the Monetary Policy Committee at some point in the future. How would you vote now?
I don't know about that. I think we could see a slight interest rate rise. I don't think that would be a disaster necessarily, because in the context of where interest rates have been in the past, we're not talking about the sorts of levels that have been really problematic. I do think that the bank is a little bit boxed in, though, in that the causes of inflation, as the Chancellor said today, are largely global in nature, rather than having an excess of money sloshing around the UK economy. And so I think there's not that much necessarily that they have control over in that regard. What I think is really important is that the government is joined up with the Bank of England, and that they help families with those rising costs through the winter, because otherwise that could be really tricky for many families.
Okay, Gerard?
Well, I think Ian's touched on it, that the implicit biases to hike maybe next week. So they have meetings in November, December, February. They're going to hike at one of those meetings, not outside the meetings. Mind you, when they met 6 weeks ago, or whatever it was, they voted 9-0 to keep interest rates unchanged. Challenge is the group think on the committee. So I think there is a bias to hike from 0.1 to maybe 0.25% next week. Today's budget, if anything, will make it more likely rather than less likely. But there are 2 other key points. It's not just inflation that's the issue here, it's financial stability. By keeping interest rates close to 0, financial markets no longer price properly for risk. At the same time, the Bank of England is now the biggest buyer of government debt. That means that yields on government debt no longer reflect demand and supply. So there's a financial stability issue. And the other point to bear in mind is the Financial Policy Committee, which sits alongside the Monetary Policy Committee. One hopes they talk to each other. They, before the end of the year, will come back about macroprudential measures, in particular lending to the property sector. So people who are thinking about buying or owning a property should not only focus on what the bank does on interest rates, but they should also keep a mind on the Financial Policy Committee and their restrictive measures in terms of people's ability to borrow.
Right, let's go to Jane in Manchester. Hello, Jane. Oh, no, it's a text question. So I can't go to Jane in Manchester. How does encouraging domestic flying demonstrate a commitment to reducing emissions? Is it even worth it economically? Now, air passenger duty is going to be cut for domestic flights, which on the face of it seems a bit incongruous given COP26 is round the corner. There is a political argument here that says, well, it encourages the union of the 4 different nations if you have a lower tax rate between the nations. At least that's how it's put to me today. And also, my colleague Matthew Thompson, who's from Northern Ireland, he's our correspondent, he was saying, well, this passenger duty, it discriminates against people in Northern Ireland because they can't get a train anywhere else in the UK. So I wonder whether they should have just done it for Northern Ireland rather than the whole of the UK. Gerard, let's start with you.
I think the key issue that the Chancellor touched on about this measure in the budget was in terms of levelling up and the regional economy, and therefore I think it should be supported. Look, in terms of the green agenda, I'm on the advisory board of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment, which is at the LSE in Imperial. It's been the leading group looking at environmental issues. And 10 years ago, people used to think if you were in favour of the environment, that meant you were anti-growth. I think a key issue, and hence I push back on this question, is that environmental issues should go hand in hand with growth issues. Sometimes there might be measures at the local level that don't necessarily help the environmental agenda on the face of it. But I think embedding the green agenda within overall economic policy in general terms will be constructive. And it was mentioned at the beginning that not much was said about the green agenda, but if you look on page 73 of the Red Book, you can see that the green agenda received spending of 5.3 billion this year, 6.5 billion next year, 9.1 billion the year after, and 8.9 the year after that. So this is big money. Okay. Maybe he didn't talk about it because he wants the Prime Minister to focus.
I'm just aware of the clock, so I'm going to ask you all to be quite brief in your answers on this. Carys.
I'm glad you brought up those figures because in my view they're vastly inadequate. We need 30 billion a year up to 2030 to meet our climate commitments. But on this point on domestic flying, I was so disappointed to see this because that's exactly right. We need to have a stronger economy with inequalities narrowed. We also need to meet net zero, and we don't level up on the back of an economy that is heading towards greater use of fossil fuels rather than less. So I thought this was really disappointing from the Chancellor ahead of the climate conference next week.
Anne?
I would be thinking the Chancellor should be encouraging people to take the train, though I acknowledge that Northern Ireland is a special case. But look, let's always remember that 22% of our CO2 emissions come from our homes. Why isn't more done to try and encourage us to be greener at home on insulating our houses and everything else like that? I thought that was a very big omission from the budget, and I cannot work out what they're spending this money on if they're spending so many billions on greening up.
Of course, it's not only air passenger duty. We also had the cancellation of the increase in fuel duty, which one could argue recognises the inflation pressures that we face, but also sends very curious signals in terms of car use. But of course, I suppose the Chancellor would argue that offsetting the decrease in domestic duties, we've seen a significant increase in long-haul passenger taxes. So we may be swapping some long flights for some short flights, which may give us a little bit of benefit.
Well, this hour has been everything I wanted it to be. Thank you very much indeed to you all. I think you've answered the questions fantastically. I think we've all learnt an awful lot over the last 60 minutes. If you missed any of it and you want to catch up, you can do so on the Cross Question podcast. Download that wherever you get your podcasts from, or on Global Player or on the LBC YouTube channel if you want to watch what's been happening over the last hour. So to Gerard Lyons, to Carys Roberts, to Anne Ashworth and Iain McCafferty, thank you very much indeed. In the next hour, we're going to get your verdict on the budget. I'm eager to hear what you have to say. 0345 6060 973. How does it affect you, either for good or for ill? It's 1 minute past 9.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, businesses in some of the industries worst hit by the pandemic will receive a 50% tax discount next year. It's costing the government around £7 billion. Families who are also struggling are also being helped.